Hi all, this is Kevin Bernatz. We're going to talk about production in Cataclysm. This is our second video on GMT's P500 game on the World War II era, but not the World War II. So production works pretty much straightforward in Cataclysm. Each turn in Cataclysm has two steps, a production phase and an action phase, and then there's a cleanup aspect at the end of each turn. For production, always occurs first in each turn, and one of the first things that's done is the U.S. decides if they're going to lend any resources. Right now, the U.S. is the only power that is capable of lending resources, either through trade with Japan, which is one of the features built in the game, or through Lend-Lease, which is again another special ability of the U.S. So once the U.S. designates any resources that's going to be lent, production is done in what we term effectiveness order. This means the lower effectiveness powers, like Italy and France, have to produce first, followed by the powers that were more politically effective at the time, like UK, Germany, US, etc. And most of the time, this actually is not important, and people can all do their production at the same time, which will help speed up play and keep the game moving along. But if there's ever a situation where a resource might need to be intercepted, or someone wants to see what another person has built prior to doing their production, it is designated that effectiveness order is the requirement should people need to enforce that. So how does production work? Well, let's look at the UK in terms of production. So the UK has on map several resources. We look in Canada, they have what we call a regular resource. And in England, they have what we call an industrial resource. And this industrial resource in England itself is a production site, which means where all the resources that are shipped must eventually end up. So the way we have done production currently in Cataclysm is we've linked it to the offensive capabilities of a power as well as to production. Think of it as a logistics constraint. This is partly because Cataclysm is an action draw game. And so, like any action draw game where there's an end-of-turn aspect of drawing from a cup, you occasionally end up where there are counters left over from the previous turn. If a lot of production units or offensive markers are left over from the previous turn, we tie that to limit the production capabilities of the country on the next turn. And this sort of keeps turns from being excessively long. It also keeps a power constrained by not using their offensives. We want powers that when they build an offensive, which if you remember from my other video, that's the military currency. So when you have units on the map, they'll just sit there until you have an offensive. And so we want these offensives to be used. And so one way to encourage that is to basically have them also serve to function to limit what a power can build. So let's look at the UK. So for the UK has several offensive markers represented by the arrows at this point. And again, remember these are playtest graphics. And on the back, they have the resource markers. So for each resource on the map that the UK wishes to ship or collect, they place one of these markers. So obviously you can see if they have a whole bunch of markers in the action cup, they'll be limited in terms of the number of resources that they can actually collect. And again, this is somewhat what we view as a logistics constraint. So they have India and they have Australia. So for resources that are shipping right to their production site, these are automatically collected. I'll just put them over here in Russia for now. For resources that have to ship overseas, these are the resources where the order of production may matter. So in this particular case, the Canadian resource would ship here, and to avoid the sub, it could go around this way, but it might be intercepted by the German surface fleet. Now the Germans have the sub out here. They also could have their sub in what we have as a dispersed state. Let me see if I can blow that up a little bit. So when the sub is in a dispersed state, it not only intercepts into its own area, but also into all adjacent areas. And so you can see this resource, no matter where it goes, is going to be subject to sub interception when the subs are operating on a more spread out or dispersed state. For argument's sake, let's say it also reaches England, and we'll put it with the other resource over here in Russia. Finally, we have the resources in the Pacific, and I'll just trace one of them. The other will do the same. You always trace resources one at a time, so it could be that a resource is intercepted and then the next resource is also intercepted. It's not like they only get to try to intercept one. They can intercept every single time. It could be something where Germany tries to intercept with a surface fleet, or Italy does, and the surface fleet gets sunk. Well, now the next resource could go through without any threat of being intercepted. So there's certainly some risk for the power conducting the interception, because that threatened being, that surface fleet or sub, may get eliminated before they can actually conduct their operation on the additional resources. So for the UK, the way we've done it is South Africa and the US, which are your two other boundaries that go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, have a requirement that there's no shipment through these areas. So if you're bringing people or armies or fleets, they can enter the area, but then the next turn or the next deployment action that you conduct would be required before they could leave. For resources, that doesn't quite work. The resources have to be collected that turn. So in order for the UK to collect their Pacific resources, they must ship them through the Med. And this encourages the UK to actually contest the Med. And it was important for them, and so therefore they either decide that they don't want those resources in the Pacific, or they must contest the resource ability to go through the Med in order to get it to England. So again, just showing how the resource would move, and it would be attempt to be intercepted by the sub here, as well as here, and then assuming that it made it, it would enter England. So in this case, let's say UK has 3 resources that successfully made it through. So what do they do with these resources? Well, once they have resources that have made it to their production sites, they look at their conversion ratio. So for a commitment of rearmament, the UK is at a conversion ratio of 1:1. That means for each resource, it generates 1 build point. Now for build points, let's see if I have the pack here. You can see upgrade markers cost 2, surface fleets cost 2, and pretty much everything else just costs 1 build point. We also have that upgrade markers and these other units either go in reserve, go in the action cup, or if it's a fortress or a surface fleet, it actually goes on the turn track. If you remember, I mentioned at the start of the turn, any counters that are on the turn track get pulled in front of the power. Well, that's how the counters get there. Basically, surface fleets and fortress units take 2 turns to come out. Everything else comes out in 1 turn. So let's say that for us, England wants to just build an offensive marker or upgrade marker. So that costs 2 of their resources. They have 1 additional resource. They can't build their surface fleet because it would cost 2. They could build their TAC, but they can also convert it to an offensive marker. Now, conversion to offensives is not affected by the conversion ratio. So it's always 1 resource goes to 1 offensive. If you use it for production, you get, in some cases, 2 or 3 build points out of it. And actually, at civilian, you only get 1/2 of a production build point out of it. But if you don't have offensive markers, then your units can't move. So in this case, England's going to build an upgrade marker and an offensive marker. And from these markers and any counters that they might have had on the turn track, they would put one counter in reserve. So we would also have pulled the flag that England started the turn with in reserve. And England can reserve 1 of these counters. Let's say they go with the flag. And then the other counters would go into the action cup. And that's how production is done. Quick, painless, and very easy. If you have any questions, Look forward to hearing from you on Board Game Geek or Consim World, and hopefully this has been a good introduction of the production system. Thank you.